Whether you're an investor or entrepreneur, the most important thing to start with is to look for these forces, to look for these exponential forces. You can do all sorts of tactical product things, everything else, but these forces are going to overwhelm you, for better or worse.
How intentional do you think you have to be as a founder about building, like you're building a tool, do you have to be sort of thinking about the network a priori, or can the network sort of emerge? Because in AI so far, we've seen a lot of tools and not a lot of networks. What's your instinct? Welcome to the A16Z Consumer Pod. I'm super excited and honored to have my partner, Chris Dixon, here today. You know, Chris, you're probably best known for your work in Web3 and network economies recently, but what folks may not know is that you led a lot of the most important consumer investments at Andreessen Horowitz, and prior, you also founded 2 consumer companies. I thought a fun place to start would be networks. That feels like the first place you really cut your teeth. So maybe talk about your investments in Stack Overflow, Pinterest, Instagram, and how you generally think about consumer networks.
So many of the most important internet services are networks, right? Going back to the early internet, email and the World Wide Web, which are still, of course, around and really important, are networks, right? And they're networks in the sense that the service gets more valuable as more people use the network, right? If you were the only one on email, it wouldn't be particularly valuable. During the, the kind of the rise of the internet in the 90s and 2000s, that's when you had things like YouTube and Facebook and later on Instagram and a whole bunch of other really important networks. If you're an entrepreneur or an investor during that period, they tend to be very valuable companies. They're very hard to build, and we can talk about that later. There's different kind of tactics and strategies for doing that. So when my background, I started 2 companies. The first was a consumer security company, and the second was a consumer AI company. And then was a personal investor. I co-founded a seed fund called Founder Collective, which was an investor in things like Uber and Venmo and Stack Overflow, as you mentioned, and just, sort of were involved in a bunch of these networks as the internet evolved. I think to really talk about networks, though, it's important to kind of step back. And the way I think about, to me, a foundational question in tech is why in tech do you have these companies come out of nowhere and end up being, very impactful, having hundreds of millions or billions of users, being very valuable, in a way that you typically don't see that in other industries, right? Like what's fundamentally different about tech? And I think the answer is that in tech, you have some very strong kind of exponential superlinear forces. So the most famous example of that is Moore's Law, right? So Moore's Law is the idea that sort of every, roughly 2 years or 18 months, the performance of semiconductors doubles. It's a rough approximation, but it's basically been true. You've seen this compounding improvement in processor performance. I think there's also kind of a broader Moore's Law, which is, storage, networking, like all the kind of computing resources just gotten much better, which is why you have things like mobile phones, right? So if you go back and look pre-iPhone, mobile phones were pretty junky and limited in capability and didn't have, touch screens and had poor performance. And what, Steve Jobs and Apple's great insight was that actually, by the way, the first iPhone also, I think I was one of the people that bought on the first day. It also was quite limited. But, part of their brilliance was they saw this curve, right? They saw this exponential curve and they rode that curve. And that, so that Moore's Law is a very important exponential curve. But the other kind of, I'd say there's 2 other really important exponential curves in software. One is what I call composability. Composability is really, I think, what's accounted for the rise of open source software. Why did Linux go from a hobby project in the 90s to the dominant operating system in the world today? The answer, a lot of it is composability. Composability means the software is open source. Anyone can contribute to it. And you can, very importantly, sort of harness the collective intelligence of the internet as opposed to locking up, only relying on your employees, right? Anyone in the world can is the famous phrase, all bugs are shallow with enough eyeballs. And, and really importantly with open source, software becomes like Lego bricks where anyone can take a piece and reuse it. And so you get this kind of compounding exponential kind of improvement growth. And then the third really important exponential force in tech is network effects, as we were talking about, which is why networks are so important, right? So they start off often quite limited. Facebook was just at Harvard, and it was essentially a real-time, kind of yearbook or whatever for students at one school. And of course, then kind of hopped by lily pads to other schools and high schools and, eventually to kind of global domination that we have today. And so they saw, Mark Zuckerberg and the team saw the this power of network effects and kind of rode those network effects. And so that's kind of why, I mean, Clay Christensen calls this disruptive technologies. It's this kind of puzzle in a way of why in tech, you have these very strong incumbents who seem to miss, and I think you could tell the story today about maybe Intel and NVIDIA or something like Intel.
Or even ChatGPT and Google. I was just reading that.
That's a great example, yes. Is that, neural networks 10 years ago were kind of toys, right?
Yes.
And I mean, they were cool. And I think, a bunch of people saw the potential of them. But the reality is it just didn't work that well, right? I mean, I remember there was a chatbot kind of VC thing in I want to say 2016 or something. I don't know if you remember that. Maybe you were
of course,
then.
Yeah, the chatbots had a moment back then.
Yeah, they had a moment. But, the reality is they weren't that good, right?
Yeah.
They just couldn't do the job. But of course, they got much, much better. And the genius of OpenAI and other pioneers in the space was to make that bet, right?
That's right.
And then Google today is in kind of an awkward position, right? Because they have this huge incumbent business that depends on, the sponsored links, and they're trying to layer in AI and do things like that. But it, in some ways it didn't come out of nowhere, but it grew, I think, faster than even some of the optimists predicted. It improved faster. And so the kind of the big takeaway here is, I think whether you're an investor or entrepreneur, the most important thing to start with is to look for these forces, to look for these exponential forces. And one of the lessons I learned in my career was, you can do all sorts of tactical product things, everything else, but these forces are going to overwhelm you for better or worse. And that the first thing to understand is that kind of landscape of these forces and how they're moving and how you can hopefully be on the right side of them.
Chris, how intentional do you think you have to be as a founder about building, you're building a tool, do you have to be sort of thinking about the network a priori, or can the network sort of emerge? Because in AI so far, we've seen a lot of tools and not a lot of networks. So and of course, in hindsight, everybody was designing a network from day zero. What's your instinct?
That's a great question. So I wrote a blog post years ago called Come for the Tools, Stay for the Network. And the idea was I was observing what I observed as sort of a tactical pattern among entrepreneurs. I cited Instagram as an example. So young people won't remember this, but Instagram actually kind of initially, its network, Instagram's network, was not a big part of the product. It had a button where you could share on Instagram, but why would you do that? Because no one was on it. And so what you would do is, I think, two things. One is they had these cool filters, which at the time you had to pay for in other services, and they gave them away for free. So kind of just, effects or lenses or whatever you want to call them. And then secondly, they piggybacked off other networks. So you'd share to Twitter. And then I think a year or two later, Twitter blocked them, and there's a whole kind of thing. You see that today maybe with Substack. Substack starts off, right, piggybacking on the email network on Twitter. My sense is they're now getting traction with their own network. You go to the Substack app, right?
That's right.
And so I think it's kind of a similar tactic. I think you could see some of this kind of come for the tool, stay for the network in I'll defer to you on this because I'm not as up to date, but modern productivity tools, maybe like Figma and Notion, things like this, where they're useful single player, right? You can just go to Notion and it's a really nice way to edit a document, or Figma to, kind of do design. But also, there are social features that I think become essential. There's always, these things are all degrees, right? Like Google Docs, I love Google Docs. I use it. I use the social features. The reality is it really a network? I could probably switch and then just share links with somebody else. But the social features layer on. Some products like Instagram, it becomes essential, right? It's just, you simply can't leave Instagram if you have a following and you want to keep that following. So it kind of varies by use case. But I think the point, by the way, I think you see some of this now in Stripe doing the Link product, which is a payment app. I think Shopify and the Shop product. Right. I think those are really nice user experiences. I don't have to type in my credit card again. Now there's kind of a network, right? Shopify originally was just kind of a tool for
sellers
for
online.
A merchant to get online.
That's right.
So I think it's a really powerful tactic, right? Because network effects cut both ways. Because network effects are great when you have them, but they're really hard at the beginning. No one wants to be on a dating site with two people, right? I mean, or something, right? And so how do you make these things useful from day one? But then the problem with single player, right, is it's just hard to defend them, right? I think you're seeing this in AI now today. You know much better, but you're seeing a lot of really cool tools because it's an amazing technology. But then it's okay, you can change your face app or whatever. But then how does it sort of move beyond faddishness, right? How does it move to something that really engages people over a long period of time? And often the answer in consumer products is networks. And so then then you have to layer in a network. The challenge is, of course, you don't want to just layer it in for the sake of it. You need to actually be useful. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you. Or what are you seeing in that area?
Yeah, well, it's actually interesting because it feels like the big networks have become hyper sensitized to this idea of new networks emerging that were bootstrapped on their networks. So I think Twitter of 10 years ago would have been a lot more asleep at the wheel to the threat of a Substack. And they were pretty aware of this potentially happening. And of course, Facebook has deplatformed a ton of companies that they thought were going to do this, and Insta and others. So one, I think the networks are more sensitive. And then on the tool side, actually, because the tools have been specializing in their own directions, and part of it is sort of product features, but part of it, even for some of the multimodal tools, is aesthetics. Midjourney just has a different aesthetic than Ideogram, so they can both coexist and they're not directly competing. So even though the tools are seemingly substitutes, like so far we haven't seen that trade-off and they're all working. Maybe that's just where we are in the product cycle. But I do think it's sort of a topic for a lot of AI founders, which is like there's not an obvious network to build around a lot of these tools, and how much of that should be sort of pre-designed versus let's just keep pushing the edge and the network will emerge.
And also it will show up in two ways, right? Like one would be in the usage. Like you might see some of these tools not get used as much, but the other is in pricing, right? Like even if you carve out a niche, how much more are people willing to pay for that niche versus those competitors, right? So
yes. Actually prices have been going up, interestingly. Like Google's top SKU is $250 a month, Grok's is $300 a month. I don't think we've ever seen a time where consumers were paying those kinds of prices. I mean, one of our sort of extreme views here is that like the future of consumer disposable income will be like food, rent, software. And then software is going to subsume a lot of the other areas of discretionary spend today.
So it's also possible. I've always suspected in tech, in Silicon Valley, we underestimate the power of just kind of brands and consumer inertia. And I think you're sort of seeing that today with ChatGPT of just like
totally.
Such a household name, like overnight almost. That even though it doesn't have in this sort of technical sense, maybe network effects.
That's
you
right.
have memory and things, but that's more stickiness, network effects. But like, just the brand effects are so powerful, right? And you become kind of known, and the Cursor is known as the best, best vibe coding platform or whatever.
That's right. Yeah, actually, I was going to ask you about that, Chris. So, of course, network effect is a gold standard for defensibility. You've maybe talked a little bit about how brand is underappreciated. You just mentioned it. Do you think being a high NPS DAU product, is that enough of a moat? Or do you think that like we really have to push for sort of these building around these compounding forces?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I mean, one argument would be the internet. I think there's a decent argument. I was actually having this argument at one of our partner offsites. Not argument, but discussion. Is that maybe a lot of the network effect has been externalized to the internet, right? And so the idea being, your Cursor, and then suddenly all of the, it becomes popular, or Midjourney, let's say, right? And then you get all of these, Midjourney influencers, YouTube videos, websites, how-to guides. And so you still, in some sense, have a network effect, but it's just not a network effect that's in the product itself. It's sort of externalized to the internet, right? And maybe that's a difference now. Like the era I'm discussing was the era when the internet was being built. In some ways, the internet is built now. I'm sure it'll hopefully improve and change, but it's built, right? It's built, and it's 5 billion users, and so maybe the rules are different now, and maybe now that effect of getting sort of all of those different the adjacent networks around you gives you, in a sense, a network effect. You show up top in search. ChatGPT recommends you. The algorithms feature you. And there's a soft sense of like a brand. People have heard of you, but it's also this whole giant kind of system, right? With all of these different interconnecting networks, might strongly favor those products, and then it becomes sort of a timing thing, right? You get in early. The timing seems quite important, like getting in, being the first to kind of own the meme, the category, and get that effect going, and then maintaining it through product velocity and high quality and everything else, which is non-trivial. It's very hard to do, I think, particularly in AI. You tell me, but to always stay on the cutting edge, it's expensive, a lot of capital. That's another thing, by the way, the capital effects in AI, right? You do well, you raise the most money. I assume the people raising $1 billion have already, proven a bunch of things, and at some point the capital becomes a moat, right?
100%. Yeah, no, it's very interesting because there's this barbelling that's happening even in software where the bigs are getting bigger, but we're also seeing the sort of, the like single person 100 million run rate company is coming, or maybe it's already here. But certainly the bigs are getting bigger and capital is a part of that.
And maybe the market's just so big that the answer is both, all of the above. It may just be that, as you said, it becomes like food and rent, and it just software is moving beyond kind of the quote unquote software budget.
It really hasn't been zero sum so far. It's been shocking. Like prices are going up and everything feels like it's working. So, maybe we'll look back and say that was a sign, but so far so good. Chris, I thought actually, since you mentioned vibe coding, it would be fun to talk about movements. It feels like you've been early to a bunch of movements, products like Coinbase, of course, and MakerBot. Those felt like niche communities on the internet when you started paying attention to them. How do you think about investing in movements, and how do you think about building around them when there's sort of questions around, is this a toy? Is this something sort of structural? Is it durable, ephemeral? Maybe talk a bit about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit to the point we were talking about the networks becoming externalized. I used to spend a lot of time, 10 to 15 years ago, just like on subreddits in kind of niche communities, partly because I'm interested in that stuff and partly because I think they're very powerful, right? If you have, if you look at Wikipedia, Stack Overflow, like a lot of these kind of interesting kind of movements, like community sites, like they're often like 20,000 people. Like they aren't that many. They aren't the millions that you might think. There's millions maybe doing a little bit here and there. But I just think a lot of, and if you look at open source software and crypto projects, like it's just a lot of things that have been kind of, popular movements that grew were really led by a relatively small, I'm saying on the internet scale, relatively small sort of hardcore enthusiasts who are really smart, often technical. And so, and it's sort of this, famous old quote, I think Williams Gibson, that the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. Like, I've always believed that. I think if you just go back historically, that's the case. That we're talking about neural networks, like that's been going on since 1943 or something. And there's been communities of people, including like a lot of the people that lead the labs today, who 15 years ago were seen as kind of more niche or something. Neural networks weren't the dominant approach. And so with that thesis, sort of you want to sort of find the next thing, then the next big thing, like one way to do it is to look around and see where these kind of, I would describe it as sort of hyper enthusiastic, sometimes cultish, they have their own language, their own norms, kind of a sense of insider outsiders. And so I got into that kind of a while ago, and that's how I got originally into Bitcoin, as I just followed those people. And I found it was one of those things where it sounded kind of silly at first, and then as you learn more about it, seemed a lot more interesting. Like that's always an interesting feature, right? There's some things you learn more about and they aren't that interesting. Some things, they are kind of silly. The moon, the conspiracy theories that the Earth is flat or something. Like I went one hour looking at that stuff, and it's like this stuff is just crazy or something, or I don't know, the moon landing conspiracies or whatever. Whereas, you dig into this stuff and you don't have to agree with everything, but there's smart people and it's very interesting. So, for me, it was like 3D printing, like this led to my investment in Oculus and Coinbase, really. We're both from that, from that thesis, sort of VR, seeing the developers and the kind of, Kickstarter community enthusiasm around, when Palmer Luckey was first creating that. It also, I got into kind of nootropics, and that led to an investment in things like Soylent, and got into, back then it was like, this is like when I joined the firm 2013, like drones, we did a few investments around that. And, just sort of looking at these interesting kind of and the hobby communities, there's a bunch of reasons why I think it's an interesting way to look at it is, one is those are the people that create these things. If you have 20,000 interesting technologists, they often build things, right? And so they're going to build some interesting products. It's also like a great kind of marketing engine, right? They're out there. They often have sort of outsized influence on the internet. They have followings. They help kind of get the energy going and build things and kind of market them. It's not foolproof, and it's hard, because a lot of these things just end up kind of being niche or don't have. I think it's going back to the exponential forces. Like you take nootropics, like that's still a thing that's around, but I don't think it's, it hasn't created a big tech company as far as I know. But I think it's partly because it's just got linear forces, not exponential forces behind it, right? There's not sort of some engine exponentially driving it to
Yeah.
have better and better products.
Maybe actually, though, if you look at a company like Function Health, Function Health is sort of the catalyst for this huge movement, consumer movement around health and quantified self. And Nootropics was a bit of the predecessor to that. So in a sense, there is this sort of slow exponential maybe, and then very rapid uptake. And I think timing is a really interesting question here, because with these movements, you don't know if they're going to play out over 100 years or 100 days sometimes.
Yeah, and you're right. Like it could just be that, like 3D printing is a good example where it's still around. It didn't kind of get as big as people had hoped. I had an investment in MakerBot back then, which was a kind of a leader and got acquired. And it's still a hobbyist thing. It's interesting. I think the limiting thing is it's in the physical world. There isn't kind of a Moore's law driving it. That said, I expect that over 50 years or something, it will become a more important thing. And you're right. It could just be a timing thing.
Yeah. The vibe coding thing, to come back to that feels like this sort of irreversible consumer phenomenon, where everybody is maybe not quite programming, but, creating software in a way that they weren't 10 years ago. How do you think of that as a sort of decentralizing force? You talked about the economics of software versus the means of production. The means of production are sort of getting decentralized through these new tools like Replit and others, Cursor. Is that sufficient to lead to a renaissance in the open web? Or what do you think are the second order implications of everybody programming?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the thing with the internet and the consolidation, the internet has become increasingly consolidated. If you just look at, I wrote a book about blockchains, and this was a kind of core theme in the beginning of the book, was talking about sort of what happened with the internet getting consolidated. It's just, if you look at metrics like the amount of money, revenue generated, the traffic, right? It's more and more, it's like 95% plus of that, both of those metrics are, now in 5 to 10 companies' hands. You can make an argument either way, like with AI, with AI, we're already seeing this in the data. A lot of AI obviates the need to click through and go to a website, right? And I think we just a report out that a bunch of travel sites and others were kind of seeing some alarming drops in SEO, which I think is kind of inevitable. If it's a mixed thing. Like on the one hand, as I'm a user of ChatGPT, and it's amazing to just get an answer, right? Not have to go and searching again after you, and go through all these websites and it's sort of this vicious cycle thing where the websites lose traffic and they get more desperate, and then they put up pop-up ads and other things, and so it becomes even a worse experience. This has been going on for 10 years. Is this kind of negative flywheel, I think, that's been going on. So look, on the one hand, it's great for consumers. You get vibe coding. And a lot of, we were investors in Stack Overflow, which, got acquired, but I think their traffic has dropped a lot because of vibe coding. And, it's this thing where vibe coding, I think probably some of the training data came from Stack Overflow and GitHub and places, but then it becomes better. And I've used Cursor to do some fun projects. It's an unbelievable tool. I think it's clearly good for the world. It is, bad for those websites. It's a great question. I think, I hope what we're seeing is a renaissance of it seems like we're seeing a paid software of sort of businesses that, they don't need to dominate the internet and be Facebook, but they can get to hundreds of millions in revenue. I think we're seeing this, right?
Yeah.
And so I think from an entrepreneur's perspective, it's a very, very exciting time. I think we can see a lot of great products. I think it's a great time for consumers. Maybe that will change over time. Maybe they'll need to layer in ads and the incentives will shift and do, kind of things that are more adversarial towards consumers. I think right now I like the AI products and that they feel very aligned with users. They're really just genuinely trying to create great products and charge for them.
Exactly. So. Yeah. We sort of call it this emergence of narrow startups, where they charge high prices and deliver, exceptional value. And maybe a controversial statement right now is that there are no marketing problems, only product problems, because the technology allows you to be so ambitious on behalf of your customer. And then the costs actually, ironically, lead to better business models, because consumer founders need to think about monetizing early. Otherwise, they're just going to go to business. So it does feel like there's a renaissance in paid software that's happening that makes it a more fun time to build than 5 years ago.
Do you think that over time that will shift potentially, because people will realize that maybe the kind of low hanging fruit is picked, the higher paying consumers, and to get the rest, you need to layer in different business models, ad-based business models, and so forth? Or
I don't know. I mean, it feels like there's so many more consumer needs that are addressable, and they're addressable in such a significant way by the technology that you can actually specialize and go very, very deep. Like there's AI therapy generally, then there's AI therapy for people that have ADHD, and then there's people who have ADHD that are in a certain life stage that perhaps want to interact in a certain way. You can just go extraordinarily deep. So I don't know if it leads to consolidation over time or if you can continue to specialize and, for a small number of people be their primary. That actually might lead to a good topic around the idea maze. Chris, you've talked a bunch about platform shifts. You've invested around platform shifts. You predicted them. One of the interesting things about this platform shift is that the properties of the platform are sort of emergent. They're not explicitly defined by Apple as iOS was. They're things that founders, and even the people training the models are discovering. Does that sort of change your mental model around platform shift? And maybe how similar or dissimilar is that to Web3?
Yeah, I mean, so the idea maze concept, this originally came from our friend Balaji Srinivasan, and I wrote about it a while ago. The way I think about the idea is that there was this old debate of with startups, are the ideas more important or the execution, right? And sort of, I think with the idea maze, the way I think about it is it says they're both important in the sense that it matters which maze you enter. I'm entering the AI maze for, healthcare, or I'm entering the AI maze for image generation or whatever. Like clearly the idea, and you go in with an initial product idea, and clearly that matters. But it also matters that, it's a maze, meaning it's dynamic. The world will shift. Like you can't predict it. So, the canonical example in my mind is Netflix, right? Netflix started off, mailing CDs, right? So the hypothesis is that movies will become, the internet has changed the way people consume movies. People will subscribe to them, but today we need to send them by mail. And then over time, they pivoted to digital distribution. And then they started getting pushback from the content providers, and they pivoted to original content, right? So they really did two almost complete company pivots, but their core maze was right? Their core maze was like the internet will lead to subscription movies in some broad sense was correct, but then they were extremely agile with respect to the implementation of that, right? And so I think to me that's the idea maze concept is you're entering a maze as an investor, and as a founder you need to think, am I a person who wants to be in this maze for 10 years? Am I willing to be agile and often persevere through difficult periods? It's often emotionally challenging, I think, but not just intellectually challenging. And so that's kind of the life of a startup. And when you think about AI, look, we have a very clear mega trend of these, of AI being, its intelligence. It's a very broad and important technology. Obviously, I think everyone knows that. And then secondly, you have these scaling laws, which seem to be quite powerful, right? The models are getting much better. And then I think an important distinction there would be there's specific scaling things like LLM pre-training or something, which I think people may have debates about, at what point do you have diminishing returns? Maybe we're hitting that. I don't know. Defer to the experts. But then that's sort of a process, but then there's the meta process. And the meta process is AI overall, right? There's people working on reinforcement learning, and I'm sure 100 different techniques. Now AI, the sort of meta process, which means like it's at this point really an economic phenomenon, which is there's all of these smart people there. There's business models behind it. There's funding, right? There's not just one process. There's many processes being explored. Kind of reminding me of Moore's Law. Like from the outside, Moore's Law, I think, like naively, I'm not a semiconductor person, is like, wow, these semiconductors magically get better every 2 years. If you read books about it, I've read a few books about it. From their perspective, they run, some fabrication technique, hits a wall, they freak out, and then some brilliant person from another lab comes up with a new fabrication technique, right? And so it was always, each process would run, and have diminishing returns, asymptote at some point, But the meta process, the sort of the bigger industry flywheel, did not, led to this smooth growth. I think my sense is AI is in that kind of, semiconductor-like place where you have this meta process that's very likely to continue scaling exponentially for a very long time. And that creates a huge opportunity for entrepreneurs. It's also a challenge, right? I mean, the opportunity obviously is you can build things with the capabilities will grow. There'll be all these new opportunities and so forth. The challenge is, are the incumbent models going to be sort of God models that subsume your use cases, and how do you kind of play that, right? And so, I think what you're seeing, right, is that you see people say, well, I'm going to go so deep on a domain that will be my edge. I know everything about this specific domain, and I know that no matter what the incumbent models do, I'll always be able to have an edge in my product, or I'll have such a good brand recognition or strong user base or reference selling or whatever it might be, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's the both kind of threatening. I mean, if you go back in the history, like with the semiconductor analogy I mentioned, like the canonical case study in Clay Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma book is the PC industry, the hard drive makers, and it was this very like kind of fruit fly Darwinian struggle where you just had like thousands of companies and very short life cycles for a lot of the companies. But then a lot of very successful companies. So, it may be a very kind of brutal process, for entrepreneurs in the sense of just like a lot of competition, a lot of other smart people, very dynamic idea maze, but also massive opportunity.
How do you think, Chris, about native versus skeuomorphic technologies in that context? Everything is changing, especially when you're building for consumer. Does the consumer change their preferences when they get, this magical new technologies invented? Or in a sense, does the emergence of the native technologies also dependent on sort of consumer preferences changing and being informed by these external forces about things like AI?
Yeah, great question. So just maybe I'll define the terms, right? So skeuomorphic and native. What skeuomorphic is a term Steve Jobs used to use with respect to design to talk about how he likes some design, like the original book app on the iPhone had like grainy stuff on the background. Design that kind of took, or the trash can on the on the desktop, computer desktop, sort of, right. It harkens back to a different form factor. It's a common pattern in technology and media is when you have a new platform or media form develop, is that people start off kind of imitating prior media forms. So early films, were shot sort of like plays with a camera and a better distribution model. And then people kind of invented a native grammar of film, and, close-ups and establishing shots and all those kinds of things. Early internet, a lot of the 90s internet looked like, you take like a catalog, a commerce catalog and put it online, or a brochure and put it online. And it took 10 to 15 years before you had things like YouTube and, modern social networking and things that really just couldn't have existed prior to the internet. User generated, anyone can upload a video and things. So I think some of it is, some of it's the technology, like YouTube you couldn't have had until you had really wide broadband penetration, right? So some of it's the underlying technology. It takes a while to kind of get there. YouTube also, when it started off, it was just like funny viral videos. A lot of it was copyright violations. It took a while to develop kind of native YouTubers, right? Content creators. Mm-hmm. So that's often just like a generational thing, I think. I think it literally is a new generation sometimes, right? People that don't look at the technology as a threat, but as an opportunity. And so that, that was a big part of it. And then part of it's the entrepreneurs just have to figure out it's the idea maze thing, right? They just have to figure it out. Like, what do people want? Like a lot of people, there was a lot of debates around YouTube's time as do people want just take football and, take NFL and stream it to the web. There were a lot of companies doing that. Tastes aren't going to change. Why would people want to watch, four people joke around or something, right? Maybe there were analogs, like is that like talk radio or is that this? But they really just didn't understand. So, I don't think human nature changed. I mean, obviously there's a new generation with different ideas. I mean, I don't think fundamentally humans changed, in a deeper sense, but it was understanding the capabilities of technology, the cultural shifts around it, the network effect around it. And so with it, I personally think with AI, a really interesting question, and I'm sure you've thought much more deeply about it than I have. It does, most likely we're in a skeuomorphic phase right now.
That's right.
And what is the native phase going to look like? Like I think it's going to be, and usually that, for me at least personally, I like the native phase better because it's kind of crazier and more interesting. So what would if you look at image generation, they're kind of just basically taking what illustrators do. And, but one thing I would mention is, like a cool thing with photography, I think, is that, when it first came along, it seemed like a threat to representative painting. And you saw kind of art move to more abstract art to kind of get away from that. And I think, you go back and read stuff at the time and there was a lot of kind of hand wringing around that. Like, is this going to, kind of cheapen this art form? But an interesting thing happened, right? Which is a new art form emerged, which is film, right? So you took, it wasn't just you're copying. So in some sense, like photographs were the skeuomorphic kind of quote unquote app of cameras, but film was the native one, right? You had a new art form. And I wonder about that with AI. Like right now you have the kind of image generation, which is kind of, taking what human might do and automating it, and movie generation and the other kind of videos we see online. But is there a new medium, for example, that hasn't emerged yet? Is it, maybe it's a virtual worlds or something? There's probably a bunch of hypotheses as to what it could be, but my experience is often surprising and it's hard to predict. But that's where a lot of the cool, creative, interesting stuff comes in. It may take another generation or, 5 to 10 years for like a new set of AI native kind of kids to grow up.
That's right. Yeah, it's actually really interesting because we're in the command line era of AI. And there's some things that, you can articulate well with words, but if I describe to you, like, what kind of music do you like? It's hard to say, we don't have the language for it, most people, to say, well, I like a certain sound with a certain sort of aesthetic and it's moody, but not too moody. And it's 110 beats per minute. Like, most people lack the language to articulate the art that they love. Mm-hmm. So even the idea of prompt to media feels skeuomorphic, and there's got to be like a more native way to explore it. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I'd be surprised if it's prompts in the long term.
I mean, I guess people are now calling it context engineering, not prompt engineering, which I think is a nice, or some people are, right? Which is, I think is a nice rephrasing, because that is kind of what you're doing, right? Is you're taking the fact that all of this stuff I do in the real world that ChatGPT isn't able to see, right? And I'm trying to summarize all that knowledge that's hidden to it, the context, and put it in there, all right? And that does feel like something that should be automated, right? If you have these intelligent machines. And I think that's what I assume that's what they're doing with these potentially new ambient devices people are creating.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, even in the media case, like my Spotify library is probably much more useful for generating music that I like versus my articulation of it.
That's right.
You'd mentioned in another pod that, if you had one sort of issue to get passionate about in the world of AI was open source and open source AI. Do you want to speak to that for a moment?
Well, we were talking earlier about the democratization of the web, or how kind of consolidated the internet is, or technology is. I think I would argue, and I think a lot of people would argue, that open source software has been an incredibly important force for democratizing technology, right? I mean, the reason that you can get a Android phone for $10 and get on the internet so cheaply, right, is that basically all the software is free. I mean, imagine if there was an open source and, operating system providers used to charge $100 and you'd be paying that on client and maybe on the back end, and there's a whole other set of stack of software that you'd be paying for, and instead you're not. Most internet users are, the vast majority of the kind of bits being hit are open source. It also is what makes, startups exist, right? We can fund startups and they can spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and, or even less sometimes, and be up and running with, really competitive, great software. And that's because of open source, right? So we, I think about a lot, and I think, on a policy side as a firm, we've been big advocates for, making sure open source is around and competitive. And, first that means not banning it, which there are bills out there, particularly at the state level, that want to put in, not explicit bans, but de facto bans. So like, for example, California had a bill that would have created unlimited downstream liability for software developers, which would have effectively killed open source. So that's step number one. And then I think step number two is, are the incentives there to create open source? I think I watched a interview, I think it was a Dworkish interview with Satya from Microsoft recently. It was a really good interview. He argued that open source will always exist because enterprise customers always demand at least one kind of open source alternative. Like they'll end up funding it.
Okay.
And that's why you always see kind of this proprietary open source, combo. But then you have, Facebook is doing it with Llama. I don't know if they'll continue to do that. There are some startups doing it. China has been very into open source. Maybe that's a kind of a national strategy. Maybe that changes at some. Maybe you do it at first to kind of create attention and kind of marketing, and then you change it. I wish there were more. It's just the thing with AI that's different than operating systems. Like with operating systems and databases, you just needed a bunch of coders sitting around. With AI, you need massive capital expenditure to train the models. So I just don't know. I think it's an unknown question long term. Are there good steady state funding models for open source? I think a possible outcome, which I think is pretty good outcome, is open source is just always a little bit behind, like the way OpenAI is now releasing older models.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's probably a fine outcome. Like for startups to exist, for consumer, we want consumers to get inexpensive healthcare advice. The next best model in 5 years will probably be good enough. For most startups, it will probably be good enough. And then for the super high end stuff, people pay for it, and maybe that's a good outcome, a good kind of equilibrium state. And maybe that's where we're headed. I hope so. I think it would just be a bad outcome if you had 4 companies that had just vastly better closed source technology and could effectively kind of charge rent to consumers and startups.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting. I think a lot about the early ethos of Android, which felt like it matched Google's sort of open web mindset. And then when it became clear that iOS was beating their pants off by being a closed ecosystem, Android became very closed and started to mimic the sort of closed iOS strategies. So we'll see what happens with Meta and Llama if they sort of replicate that. But that's a worrying dynamic. I think that the more optimistic case is that we haven't yet seen the same sort of app platform feedback loop and the lock-in that you get from the foundation models. So, there is sort of a case for them to continue to release the next best model and for the models to be somewhat substitutes for each other so far.
Yeah, the Android case is a good kind of, I think, cautionary tale, right? Because I think that maybe in some technical sense, some of the code is open source, but it de facto isn't, right? All the services, everything
That's
else,
right.
like you need
That's right.
permission. And it was one where they kind of made lots of overtures that way. So that would be the worry. But it does seem, I think it feels a lot better than it did 3 years ago or something with the China open source stuff. The policy stuff is better. We're seeing, the fact that OpenAI is doing older models, like it seems like we're in a better spot for open source. I think some of it's also the scaremongering that like a chatbot's going to murder everyone or something is like, that's like literally 0 people have died from ChatGPT so far as it's just the whole, so I think that maybe people are chilling out on. And so it feels like we're in a much better spot. I'm cautiously optimistic on open source.
Yeah, 2 years ago, the conversation was a lot about, if OpenAI is the only game in town, over time, they take all the economics of the complements. And it doesn't feel like that's happened, which is, to your point in the amazing book about ballooning, it feels like that's why there's a lot of interest in acquiring IDs, because they understand that like if the foundation models start to become more interchangeable, they're going to have to move upstream and own, user-facing economics. Amazing. Well, Chris, thank you so much. It's great to hear you talk about sort of consumer and AI and all of the implications. And we're super thankful to have you at the firm.
Well, thank you. This was fun.